Are you ready to take your privacy knowledge to the next level? Enroll in the Certified Information Privacy Professional United States course today. That's the CIPPUS. Learn everything you need to know about U.S. privacy laws and regulations, from private sector data collection limits to government access and workplace privacy. Stay ahead of the curve with emerging topics like artificial intelligence, data portability, and state privacy laws. This course is perfect for privacy professionals, newcomers to the field of cybersecurity, mid-career professionals trying to pivot into cybersecurity, legal experts, and anyone passionate about data protection. Don't wait. Click on the link in the show notes to sign up now and boost your privacy expertise. You can use the promo code TBP sale for 20% off before January 31, 2025. That's promo code TBP sale, like the Big Picture Podcast sale, for 20% off before January 31, 2025. Thank you. So thanks for joining us on another episode of the Big Picture Podcast. Today I have a special guest, someone I first learned about back in April of 2020. And I basically told everyone about her former role and everything she does and everything she did. And as God would have it, we're speaking 4 years later. So I'm not going to do the introduction. Over to you.
Great, Bidemi. Well, I'm very, very honored to be here. That's a lovely introduction. I spent 10 years working in the CIA as an undercover counterterrorism officer. And as you are very aware, I published a memoir about that experience in 2018 called Breaking Cover. Since leaving the agency, my husband and I have been running a boutique security firm consultancy that advises a lot of foreign businesses doing work in the Middle East, particularly on risk assessments and how to carry out operations in these places that's really opaque business environments, and people run into a lot of problems doing business in the Middle East. So we usually get called when diplomacy is required with government entities and vetting is required of potential business contacts and middlemen and all of that. So that's what we've been doing ever since. And of course, my I wouldn't say it was a side hustle. I'd say is my passion is encouraging others, especially using these incredible lessons that I learned in the CIA and since to help other people realize their full potential. So that's my heart. That's where I'm coming from. And now I have a second book coming out trying to do just that. So here we are.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So during your brief introduction, you mentioned you were a former counterterrorism officer. I know the difference. Most people don't. What's the difference between a CIA officer and a CIA agent?
Yes. Okay. So yeah, most people have no idea. So in the CIA, we call our sources our agents. Our sources of information are people that we develop and recruit for either foreign intelligence collection or other similar programs. Maybe someone is doing something for us. We call them the agents, which is totally different than the FBI officials, which are called agents themselves. So you'll notice that the rest of us from the CIA call ourselves either intelligence officers or intelligence officials and not agents.
Got it. Thank you for that. So you had a career in the CIA. To rewind all the way back, what motivated you to join the CIA? How did your background and education and maybe some other things you might want to share, how did all those things basically align with what the agency's requirements were? I read somewhere in your first book that you actually applied more than once.
Yeah. Yes, it was a long road into the CIA, and it was a very ugly, difficult one. But
Wow.
growing up in a small town here in Central Florida, I didn't know anything about the world, like literally nothing. So I never dreamed of this, and it was not something I could even work towards. I just didn't even know that was an option. But I just kind of had that desire to do things different. So right after I graduated high school, I went on my first mission trip to Egypt and worked in an orphanage. And so this month-long trip to Upper Egypt kicked off like, whoa, there's this big world out there with very different cultures, which is so fascinating for an American who's never been anywhere. And then I started just continuing to make decisions that really got off the beaten path. So as an undergrad, I studied abroad for a semester in Egypt. We went to Israel and the West Bank. I learned all about that conflict at that time. I ended up getting a master's degree in Arab studies at Georgetown. Again, not entirely knowing what I was going to do with that, but I knew it was a stepping stone into government or a think tank or journalism. Like, I wasn't sure. Like, I knew I needed a job, like really need a
Wow.
job. And so I didn't strategically apply to the CIA. I applied to like 1,000 government jobs. And it turns out that it was literally the only response I got was from a CIA recruiter. And so I didn't know at that time that I was CIA material. I had no idea. I just thought there were like these special 007s out there, primed from birth, you know. I didn't know you could be like a normal person and be in the CIA. But when the recruiter called me, they said, well, we're very fascinated by one, that you've gotten a master's degree in Arab studies, but also you've traveled so much to the Middle East. Like, it's very clear to us you have an adventurous spirit, you have a desire to learn, and those things are really important in the CIA, that you can feel comfortable moving around a foreign environment. And so I had no idea that who I had become and the knowledge I was gaining was aligning perfectly with the CIA requirements. However, if you're like me, nothing is easy. So when I first got hired into the CIA, they had identified me to be a leadership analyst. So that would be someone who stays in the DC area as an analyst, who looks at the incoming intelligence and then tries to understand, say, like Saddam Hussein, like who is Saddam Hussein, and what is this dictatorship all about? And then right before I was supposed to start that job, I graduated from Georgetown. They withdrew the offer of employment from me. The CIA said, you no longer meet our requirements for this position, which I was like, well, I have no idea what he could have possibly done. And I think it's important to tell your audience, because you've got a lot of people in the audience who are interested in government jobs. There's a lot of times things are not straightforward. Turns out that had I taken that job, I would have never been able to be on the other side of the CIA, which was the operational side. After I learned there's this other side, and my husband started applying to the Directorate of Operations, or the clandestine service, they said, wow, you have a wife and she's similar to you. Like, she has, so this is before 9/11, which is interesting, because people are like, okay, we have plenty of Arab analysts. Like, we have plenty of people in the government who know about the Middle East. But we went through this long vetting process, as one does, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yep.
The lengthy and background investigations and interviews and all the stuff you have to go through, and the polygraphs. And then at the end of that road, we were about to start training with the CIA, and my husband actually started training. 9/11 occurred. And I was about just months away from starting my training. And then suddenly, on September 12th, the U.S. government didn't have enough Arab, people who understood the Arab world. Now we became like this really important resource to the U.S. government. So it's funny how those fortunes kind of flipped overnight. And we were really pre-positioned to be in the war, to be involved in the war on terror from the very beginning. So it was a very fascinating career.
Wow. That is, I want to say there was a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, your steps were basically ordained.
I do believe that.
Everything lined up, and then you were like, oh, this is the job I applied for, and then they turned me down. And then interestingly, they actually wanted me on the other side, so it was a good thing they turned me down.
A lot of
Wow.
people are so, it's so hard. Rejection is terrible. No, nobody wants to be rejected.
Right,
But the
right.
lesson to me from that was I do believe that was ordained. I do believe I got in exactly where I was supposed to be. And then I realized that rejection is often the tool that gets you where you need to be. And I was
Wow.
like, wow, if I
Wow.
could really understand that, my life would be very different.
Yeah, because when it's happening, we get so devastated and discouraged. And you're like, in the book, you said it took you 6 months or thereabouts, and you didn't even want to take the call of a family friend saying, I applied, I got in, maybe you guys can take a look. And you're like, okay, well, if my husband is doing it, maybe I can try again. And then the whole thing with the polygraph, and I don't even want to bring that up.
Yeah, I hate the polygraph. But yeah. So it was painful because I was like, well, I'm still not sure why I got rejected from that analyst position. So I don't know why the other side of the CIA would be okay with me. I later learned that the CIA has to overhire for positions because not everyone will get through the background investigation and the
Right.
vetting. So because I had so much international travel and family, mine took longer than other people, so they got through the clearance process first. It would have been nice if they had just told me that, but
Yeah, yeah. They hardly tell you why they do certain things, and I'm all too familiar with that. It's another podcast entirely. Anyway, moving on. So there are some certain qualities that the CIA looks for. I brought up the polygraph earlier just to kind of highlight the fact that, well, some polygraph results might say you're either lying to us or you're a psychopath, and then
yeah.
apparently, such qualities are in high demand in certain agencies. I don't know. I'm not in those agency policy making offices. Can you elaborate on some of the qualities that the CIA actually looks for in candidates, like curiosity, language skills, for example? You mentioned emotional intelligence.
Mm-mm.
How does that tie in?
Yeah, EI is huge. Emotional intelligence is the ability it's like the street smarts. It's
Right.
all that stuff you can't learn in a book that you have to learn on the mean streets of Cairo. It's like, how do you get along in life? Can you make decisions quickly? Are you, the one thing that they kept saying is we need people who are not scared of living a very different life, who can make decisions on the fly, and who are not easily stressed.
Hmm.
I mean, forget it. If you're easily stressed, don't even think about applying for any kind of government job like that. Um, then they also said, like, it's very important to us because you're going to be doing the most sensitive operations. You're going to be dealing with incredibly sensitive information. We have to know that we can trust you. Um, and so you've got to be honest. Like, you can't be having issues with drinking or drugs. Thankfully, that stuff never interested me. Like, never did. You've got to be honest. You've got to have integrity. These are all really important, values. And interestingly, as I explain in the book, they want you to be honest, but then you have to spend your entire career with the CIA lying because you've got a cover to maintain. So they're like, we want you to be honest, but we need you to lie, and we need you to be okay with that.
In the back of your first book, you actually wrote the CIA is looking for walking contradictions, and I believe that ties into what you were just describing, saying you need to be of the highest possible integrity. However, you're going to spend 99% of your career in other countries breaking those countries' laws.
Yeah. Yeah. Think
So,
about that. That's not a small thing, which
yeah,
goes back to exactly like um, being easily stressed. I mean,
mm,
again, that's a pretty stressful proposition. And even if
right.
thinking about that makes your head want to explode, you probably shouldn't pursue that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Another thing is there are some perceived weaknesses that we have as individuals. And interestingly, the CIA considers those perceived weaknesses as strengths. Do you have examples you can
So,
state? And
yeah. So actually, I don't think they necessarily did. I think that, and I think things have changed a little bit in the CIA since I was there. I've been out for 12 years, but I can tell you when I got into the CIA, um, leadership, everyone in leadership positions was very like, you walk down the hall and you do not smile at people and you do not greet them. There were a bunch of older men that were just very like stoic and
stoic.
difficult to deal with. They treated their employees, honestly, terribly. There was no sense of mentorship or anything. Like, it was kind of shocking. And I'm like, what the heck is going on here? And so I think when you're coming in from the outside and you're from, say, a small town like I was, it's easy to get intimidated because you think, like, do I have to be like that? I mean, because look at me, I'm not like that. Um, and then I realized later on that all the things that I thought made me weak or made me not a good candidate for leadership in the CIA actually were what helped me to become really good at my job. But it took me years in the CIA to figure that out. Like I figured out because of my emotional intelligence, because of EI, how to flip things. So I might have to deal with a terrorist who thinks a woman should never leave the home, should never be uncovered in front of a man that she's not related to, and should absolutely never be involved, like in the messy world of counterterrorism in the Middle East. I've got to somehow get that guy to work with me. So I have to figure out how to flip that liability of my gender, of my background, of the fact that I'm a very smiley, engaging person. And when I did that flip, I realized that now I was like a unicorn. So these guys, once they realized I was intelligent and and I knew what I was talking about, which was very rare. Most people in America do not know the Middle East. They wanted to work with me. They would jump through hoops to work with me. And so it was a really cool, again, it's one of those life lessons. You're like, man, you can make the flip. You can flip it.
Yeah, you mentioned one of your, I want to say, role models, Virginia Hall, a role model for women in your line of work. So how does her story, who is Virginia Hall, what did she do to influence your career and how you approach intelligence work, basically?
Yeah, so Virginia Hall wanted to be in the Foreign Service. This was in the 1940s, and there were only a couple of women who worked in the State Department at all. It wasn't a time when women were considered actual candidates for the diplomatic service. And she was well traveled, and she knew multiple foreign languages. Like, she had lived abroad in Europe quite a bit. Man, that lady she was amazing. She was in her 20s. And then things went from, she got rejected multiple times by the Foreign Service. And then she blew off her lower leg in a hunting accident, or actually while she was climbing over a fence when she was hunting. So then now she's a cripple back in that, that's how they would refer to somebody like that. What's so fascinating, she was rejected from the State Department, U.S. State Department. She ended up getting recruited by Churchill into the special direct operations, I forgot now what it was called, to basically go into Nazi-occupied France as an undercover operative.
She was recruited by the United Kingdom, basically.
Exactly. Yes.
Wow.
And she was one of the most effective operators behind enemy lines. And it's because she took advantage of that peg leg of hers, missing a limb. She wasn't good enough to be a diplomat, but she was good enough to be like a secret operative, literally like collecting intel, being a radio operator, when most radio operators had a lifespan of literally 2 or 3 weeks in the field before they were found and tortured and killed. She spent years in the field. Like, this woman was an inspiration to all of us. And so again, crippled, she used it to her advantage. The Nazis would look at her and they'd think, oh, what is she? She's not a threat. And she would even like take on the persona of like an old lady or a, crippled farmhand. And so she went places where no one else could go.
Wow. Tons of life lessons from your first book and now the upcoming book as well, which we'll get to in a second. For the most part of your career, you were basically a counterterrorism officer. Again, not agent, officer. And the skill that entails is what's known as human intelligence, humans. So for our listeners, again, I'm familiar with all these terms, but for those who are listening to you for the first time, what is humans? What's the significance in intelligence operations?
Yeah, so there's so many different kinds of intel collection, and one of them is human intelligence. So that literally means you are meeting with human sources of information who are giving you your foreign intelligence. They're giving you the insights that you need to make important decisions. And we have signals intelligence, that we collect digitally. And so I think intelligence works really well when you have both. When you have a digital collection of intelligence, lots of data, but then you have to be able to put that data into context. And that's often why well-placed human sources can be so helpful to the US government.
Right, right. So, for some who are familiar with open source intelligence, I feel like that's the one most people know. If you Google something, you're basically looking up intelligence that is open source.
Right.
If you look on a website that is publicly available, you don't have to log into the website to get information like Google. All the other websites that provide information, government websites, for example, your local public library, all those are open sources of intelligence. There is humans, like you just described. And of course, when using humans, there are things you need to be able to learn to know so that you can do your job well. So we call them tradecraft, basically.
Yeah.
So can you describe some of these tradecraft as much as you can disclose?
Sure. So there's different kinds of tradecraft because, as you just pointed out very eloquently, not any information raises to the threshold of what the CIA is looking for. We're not looking for the open source intelligence or OSINT. We're looking for the secret information, the hard to get stuff. And the way that you get that is there's tradecraft for carrying out an operation to literally the logistics of meeting with someone. And then you have tradecraft that is applicable to the actual interaction with your source. And I think that's the part that fascinates me most. Like, of course, the logistics are important. You don't want to out your source by meeting with them or leading someone to your secret location or your secret meeting. But I am super fascinated by the tradecraft of trying to figure out if somebody's lying to you or not. Because, a lot of people will pretend that they have access to secret information. They do it for a variety of reasons, and you've got to be able to figure out whether it's good info or bad. And I would say people would be surprised. More often than not, we get bad information, fabricated, lying, stuff that's actually in open source. So we have to be able to get really, really good at vetting what we're getting from someone, and also just looking for red flags during the meeting with a person.
So you mentioned red flags. What are some red flags that can tell me that this person is actually maybe a double agent and then they're trying to get information from me to give to this other intelligence agency, or they're just looking for a payday, and so on and so on? What are some red flags?
So for me, I think that I have to look very closely at the genesis of the relationship. How did we meet this person? Because a lot of foreign governments will dangle in front of our faces somebody who looks interesting, hoping that they know what the CIA is looking for. So they hope that this dangle will interest you and you'll try to recruit them. And in those cases, we think, oh, look at this amazing guy I found. You have to think, wow, was that a dangle? So you have to look at how they came to our attention. And then the other thing that's so important, and I'm telling you that most intelligence professionals skip this altogether. They kind of put on this like American mindset that everything everybody says to me is true. Like, Why would you go into intelligence with this mindset that everybody's being honest all the time? It's just not how it works. So I question everything. I don't think anyone's telling me the truth until I can prove it otherwise. And so if you're the leader of an Al-Qaeda cell, then I'm going to be looking for you to explain to me how you became a leader of that cell, how you make decisions. I want to know everything about that cell. I want to know. I could spend, 5 days debriefing you on this intel. And I'll tell you something. We had so many sources who said, I am either a member or a leader of Al-Qaeda cell, and they couldn't answer 30 minutes worth of questions about that cell.
Wow.
But because liars are very, very good at deflecting. So they don't want to give you time to answer questions. So they come to a meeting and like, I have all this important information to give you. And so the officer takes down all this really important, threat-related information, never gives them time to be strategic in their debrief. And that's how we get run by our sources when we're not paying attention.
Wow. So basically, attention to detail goes a long way.
Oof. Yes.
And you were describing in your first book, basically how to the point where in certain parts of the world, there are norms and customs that for someone who's keeping steps, if you don't pay attention, if, for example, two people want to enter a room, one person has to be on the left, one person has to be on the right. And this is not just gender roles. This could be hierarchy roles. Maybe the most senior person has to be on one side or the other, but you as the officer, you're not paying attention. This person claims to be a leader, but they are entering the room on the side where the subordinates should be entering.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, there's all these subtleties. And if here, this also answers your earlier question. What is the CIA looking for? It's looking for people who know some foreign culture really well. And I can tell you, this is a weakness in Americans. We are physically isolated as a country. We don't get to be a part of Europe and travel so closely and easily and cheaply to other places. So we don't have that depth of knowledge of culture of what you're just saying right now. How would the head of a tribe act? How do they behave? How do they interact with each other? Because if you know what to expect, and then they walk in that room and they don't walk with authority, and it's interesting just even how a person holds themselves, or how you should address them. Because in the Middle East, it is very important that you address people properly. If someone's well educated, you need to say, ya doctor, ya doctor. There's different ways to address a man of learning versus someone who left school and middle school, right? So you're going to talk to them in different ways. You're going to interact with them in different ways, and they will notice.
Yep. Before we started recording, I was describing to you some of my background, and there was a briefing I was privileged to present in a particular office in a particular part of the country. And I was showing them my assessment of a picture. There was this picture from one part of the world, and two people were talking. And there is this gesture certain people do when they're speaking. And then this picture showed one man addressing a group of people, and he was making this gesture. For those listening and cannot see, I'm basically pointing, touching my thumb and my index finger with my palm facing me. And that gesture is made in a specific context during a specific type of presentation in a part of the world that shows the person's position and authority and so on. And I was just presenting my own assessment. I had no clue where the picture was taken. They asked me a question and I was giving them my assessment based on my exposure, education, experience, etc. And then I left the briefing, and then they finished their meeting. I wasn't there when they concluded the meeting. And then they came back and told me, oh, that simple description I just gave about that picture with this person doing this cleared a lot of things for them. And I was just like, really? I don't know.
I love that. That's so cool. That's just so cool. I love it.
So apparently, I've been doing the kind of things you were doing way before, and I had no clue. So who knows?
Well, this is exactly why we need people like you who will understand a part of the world that someone like me can't access, right? Or has a difficulty, a real challenge to access the nuances of that culture. Like we need people who speak foreign languages and can operate seamlessly in those environments. Yeah, it can make just your reading of that made such a difference.
Yep, yep. So we mentioned humans is one type of intelligence collection method. And from my own background with all the technical intelligence and all the cyber intelligence, of course, all these intelligence collection methods work hand in hand. Someone who works at NRO, the National Reconnaissance Office, they study maps all day long. That's one type of intelligence. We call it GeoInt, geographic intelligence, imagery intelligence. Of course, that cannot stand alone. You need someone like you who would provide a human intelligence saying, my source on the ground identified this yellow brick building with a minaret on top as the actual mosque in the city. You thought you saw a mosque from a satellite image. No, that is a decoy mosque. The actual mosque, I'm telling you, my source was on the ground. They have a different mosque because they want to do shady stuff and so on.
Mm.
So imagery intelligence gave us one thing, but the human on the ground confirmed it. So all of this to basically set up my next question saying, how does humans complement technical intelligence operations from your perspective in counterintelligence and my perspective in cyber intelligence? So humans and technical stuff.
I think the easiest way to say that is good human can put that into context. Yeah. So often we see things, but we don't know what is the significance of what we're seeing. And you need someone who's been on the ground or currently on the ground to say, like, oh yeah, actually that looks like a mosque, but that's not what they're actually using. So that human sources are very challenging to recruit, very hard. There's nothing easy about that process. But if you can get the well-placed individuals, they can make such a difference to that human collection. When you get a SIGINT piece or you get the imagery piece and you're like, I think I'm hearing this, but I don't know what that means. Humans can fill in the gaps. And so that's why, if you get good collectors working in tandem, I love that. I did that a lot in my job. I love to work with different collectors of different kinds of intelligence. Hey, we're here. If you guys need an insight or an assessment, we're here to help you out. Likewise, you see something, you need something from us, from our human sources, you let us know. And so working together is what makes it actually the magic happen.
Nice. Sounds good. So you spend a lot of time in the Arab world, and I noticed the way you describe Arab world, you didn't necessarily say the Middle East. I'm not about to ask you where you served. No, I'm not going to do that. I know better than to do that. So we're just going to go with Arab world.
Okay.
As a woman in the Arab world, a funny story in the book was actually you and your husband had to work together a lot of times, and he forgot to take off his ring. And you also forgot to take your ring off. So you took yours off, but then he held his ring in his palm and then he fell onto the table. So
we were really sly.
What were some challenges that you faced individually, you and your husband, and so on?
That was one for the books. Joseph had a mid-level insurgent, terrorist that he was handling. And this guy was really sharp. He was really street smart. And of course, you never want your source to know that you're married because that's too much information. And so Here we are. We've been married for a long time already. You're like, we have to hide the fact that we know each other so well, which is interesting. So We're just colleagues here. And I was bending down to get something out of the little fridge in our debriefing pod. And he whispers in my ear, Joseph comes up to me and he's like, take off your ring. I was like, oh crap, because I always would take off my ring before my meetings. So I took it off, and we sit down. Joseph had taken his ring off, and that individual felt comfortable talking to Joseph because he thought he was Muslim, and most people from the Middle East are Muslim. Well, Joseph didn't generally correct them on that. And so the most, this particular guy had really crazy ideology, which said you can't even wear a gold ring. Like somebody like him thinks that only kafirs wear gold rings. And so to have a gold ring, and you would wear it, and if you wore a silver ring, you wear it on the opposite finger.
That's a non-believer.
Thank you. And so the fact that he had a gold ring and he was wearing it on his left hand instead of a silver ring on the right hand would identify him as not Muslim, or not an extreme Muslim, I should say. And then Joseph dropped the ring and it started bouncing across the table towards the terrorist source, who was watching this gold ring bounce
in slow motion.
And Joseph grabbed it and about started we're trying to pretend like it never happened. I'm thinking, oh my God. So, everybody thinks we're really cool. And then you hear those stories and you're like, we're still human beings.
Oh, wow. And then there was the story of how you had to babysit a mom of a toddler, and then your husband went to take a walk, but apparently they didn't take a walk. And I'm not going to say what happened. You say what happened.
Okay, so I generally have a hard time interacting with women. I want to be where the action is. But when we're, Joseph's we've invited this individual to our house who was a target for recruitment, I should say. And so I have to entertain his wife. And my Arabic is okay, but very foundational. It's not fluent. And it's very Egyptian oriented, or Fusha, which is official Arabic oriented. And she was from, I can't say which country, but she was not even from the capital. She was from a village in the middle of nowhere. So her Arabic barely even sounded like Arabic to me. She used words that I had no idea what they were. So Joseph was like, after dinner, I'm going to take him out, and we're going to walk around the grounds of where we live, and I'm going to try to get him to give me some sensitive information. I'm like, okay, you go do that, and I'll be with the wife and I'll entertain her. And it was so painful because they were gone for hours. And I'm telling you, I expended all my Arabic after about 30 minutes. I couldn't say another word. And she's looking at me. She's exhausted. I'm exhausted. The baby is exhausted. We're so bored. We're literally, I couldn't even think of enough stuff to do. And then after 2 hours, they come back. They finally leave. And I said to him, you must have gotten some great intel because you were gone for 2 hours. Please tell me you got something amazing. And he's shaking his head. I'm like, why are you shaking your head? No. He's like, it was bad. I'm like, what? What was bad? He goes, he took me to a bar. He took me to a bar so he could meet his girlfriend while I entertained his wife. And by the way, one of the topics she was discussing was how much, how America was very immoral, and men and women got lots of divorces, and how terrible we are as a culture. And I could barely defend myself, and I had no idea that in that moment he was smooching his girlfriend.
Ouch!
And I swear you can't make this stuff up.
Yeah, it's. I guess that just goes to show that it's not like we see in the movies, right? Operations just don't go according to plan ever. And you have to be stuck babysitting a mom and a toddler. Wow.
Oh, God. It's a good story now, but I'm telling you, in the moment, it was awful.
Yep. So are there any other memorable experiences from your time in the Arab world that had a significant impact on you as a person?
Oh, so many. My goodness. That breaking cover is full of those moments. I think probably one of the scariest moments was when I had to use my counter ambush training. It was during our first deployment. It was in a country which is very much now considered a war zone, but at the time was like on the threshold. But everyone was very clear this is a dangerous place. There was a lot of carjacking and kidnapping. And at one point, a lot of Westerners would get targeted for a kidnapping, but then they would get treated really, really well by tribesmen, and they would be used as a bargaining chip with the government. But then once Al-Qaeda came onto the scene, things changed, and now Westerners were taken as targets of opportunity, sold to Al-Qaeda, and then killed on a video, had their necks slit on a video. So we had told each other, like, you can never get taken. Like, it's better to die trying to run away or get away than to get taken. And so I was driving to work one morning, and I was stopped at a stoplight, and there was a car beside me and there was a car behind me, and I was up against the curb. So it was kind of like hemmed in. No big deal. I'm just stopped at a light. And this man was crossing the street in front of me, and I was by myself because Joseph was traveling for an operation. And he looked up through the windshield and he saw that my face was uncovered. And this was a country where women were monakaba, so they were completely covered. And it was apparently too much for him. And so he started carrying out an activity. Probably easiest just to say he was starting to self-pleasure in the middle of the road right in front of my car.
Wow.
And I had traveled a lot in the Middle East, and I swear I've never seen anything like it before then or since then. Never. And it was just like 9 a.m, like in full broad daylight. And I was shocked. I'm like, what is going on? I cannot believe he's doing this. Like, I can't believe he's doing this. And as I'm processing this embarrassment, I'm realizing that it's starting to become a spectacle. And so men are emerging from the storefronts to see what's going on. And I had been in that country long enough to know when there was like a car accident, literally hundreds of men would swarm the car and try to see through the windshield to see if there were women, uncovered women or whatever. They're just really bored in that country and don't have a lot to do. So there's a spectacle. And I suddenly realized, oh my God, I'm on the X. And this is a security term for, like, when you're ambushed, the site of the ambush is an X. And in order to survive, you have to get off the X. Well, I realized, oh my God, the longer he stands there doing this activity, the more I'm actually on an X, because I see men coming from every direction. They are a country awash in weapons like AK-47s and knives and all of these things, and I don't have anything. And if they look in this car and they see I am an unaccompanied female, Western female, that's it. I'm done. So I realized I am sitting on the X. And if I don't act quickly, then this could devolve in a bad way. So I ended up using my CIA training and using my car as a weapon. And I had to hit that man twice before he finally got up, moved out of the road. And then I, gunned it all the way to work and didn't stop like for one more stoplight. So I think that I reacted well. I reacted quickly, and thank God, because in these locations that are so unstable and there's a lot of Al-Qaeda running around, things can go sideways so fast. And so you have to have the right response within that window of time.
Wow. And this is a perfect segue into your upcoming book, titled appropriately, Get Off the X. And like you described, it's a terminology, it's a phrase in intelligence circles. I believe the law enforcement is now co-opting it gradually, basically saying if you have a map and they say X marks the spot, that's, I believe, where that was borrowed from. The X in this case is where the adversary controls. That's where they are most comfortable. That's where they can deploy their resources most efficiently. From my own background, I would say the X is where, for example, a unit can execute a maneuver, maybe like a choke point, or they can execute a pin down and then basically trap you in and then you're basically at a disadvantage on the X.
Mm-hmm.
So getting off the X is very, very important, and it doesn't come to us naturally. You wrote in Breaking Cover that the human tendency to freeze in the context of a threat may be a native biological response to extreme stress. So basically, all your organs are shutting down, preparing you, or basically protecting you from being eaten.
Yeah.
Because if you play dead, then you're not exactly palatable to the predator.
Right.
But guess what? Staying on that position, it's not going to do you any good. Because how do you know the predator is not exactly looking for an immovable
Mm.
prey?
Yes, exactly.
So, yeah, yeah. And I was just going to ask, there are principles of getting off the X. Of course, it comes by training. Most animals, most humans would rather freeze. That's why sometimes an accident happens simply because the person stood in the middle of the road
Yeah.
instead of leaving, and then a truck hits them or another car hits them because they saw the accident about to happen. They froze in place, and then the accident happened. So, what would you say is some of these principles that we can basically apply in any situation, not just like work related, not just like I'm about to join the CIA, I need to get more counter ambush training. So just principles to get off the X, literally and figuratively.
Yeah, so the ability to push through that freeze response is something that you practice over time. And so they gave us this ambush training because they're training our brains. This is what you do when you're under massive stress. You move. It was just that simple. You step off the X, you move. And that can apply to any part of life. I was just watching videos of the tsunami in South Asia that occurred like I can't remember how many years ago that was. And you'd see this big tsunami wave and this man standing on the beach, and he's just standing there frozen as he watched this giant wave come in. He doesn't even try to run. That's being frozen on the X. Not that necessarily running would have saved him, but you could just see that he had that freeze response. And so what you have to do is to say, okay, when I'm uncertain, when I'm scared, I'm still going to push through and I'm going to move. And so that's applicable if you're trying to save your own life. Like you're in New Orleans and this guy is coming down the road with his truck. The people who were able to get out of the path of the truck, who realized something was happening. I've seen footage of these people that were literally inches from being hit by that truck, but they moved in time. So it can save your life physically, but also I've taken this concept of get off the X and I'm thinking like this really applies. It's like a metaphor for life. How often do we get stuck in our career or our personal lives because out of indecision, like uncertainty, fear, intimidation, and because we don't know what that perfect next move is, we just do nothing. And so we wither on the X of the comfort zone. And I want to tell people, I want to encourage them that you don't have to know the next perfect step. You just have to move, literally, and sometimes I would just say like, if I've accomplished anything, it's literally because I took one baby step at a time, maybe imperfect steps, but I kept going nonetheless. And this is how I've ever achieved anything meaningful. I'm not necessarily smarter or more capable than other people, but I tell you one thing, I do not give up. And I'm trying to help other people develop that muscle of perseverance that says, yeah, it is going to be hard and you shouldn't give up. And
Wow.
and I just from talking to you in this short period of time, I know you're that person. And that I think that's such an inspiration to me and to a lot of people. As an immigrant, what it's like to keep going and pushing forward. And yeah, it's hard. And yeah, it hurts. And yeah, it's a struggle. And you keep doing it anyway.
Wow. This is so profound in so many levels. I knew I was going to get this feeling before I talked to you. I just didn't know how much of this feeling I was going to get. So you described how you could tell that I'm similar, and you're not wrong in that assessment, because I came to the US in December of 2012, 12 years ago. Came for my master's and PhD, and I was able to get a job, thankfully. And I've worked at different organizations here and there in the US. And every opportunity I had, I basically reminded myself that I have to make the most of it, because I have an accent. I look different than most people in the country, at least in my field. And guess what? I'm still able to convince recruiters to bring me onto new roles every now and then. And I started a podcast in January of 2021, January 11, 2021. And the people I know were saying, what business do you have starting a podcast in this field where there are tons of people doing podcasts like this one you plan to do? Why would anyone listen to you? And I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to do it anyway. If someone wants to listen, fine. If someone doesn't want to listen, fine. I wasn't doing it for people to come listen to me. Guess what? None of the things I was saying is new information. I'm just saying all these things from my own perspective. If someone finds it interesting, they would listen. 4 years and some change later, now it's literally going to be 4 years in 4 days. Funny how that works.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And so far, everyone has been saying, oh, wow, you're doing a good job. And I look back and say, at what point did I decide to keep going? Because now I tell people it's difficult to stop doing the podcast than to continue. Initially, it was difficult to continue. It was more difficult to continue than now. It's the other way around. Now it's a habit. Now I see myself as someone who has a podcast habit.
I love it.
I don't even consider myself a podcaster. I just wake up every Thursday. There's an episode going out. How it happens, I literally don't know. Before you know it, 5 a.m. on Thursday, there's a new episode. And then people would text me and say, oh, wow, you keep going 300 and something episodes. How do you do it? And I honestly cannot say how I do it. But when you break it down this way, saying baby steps, that's all it takes. And then it has a compounding effect because I just wake up one day, I do some little research, and then I close my laptop, and then the next day another research. Before you know it, an episode is ready. And then I just record, and then I edit, and then I publish. And then baby steps for 4 years.
Yeah.
Now it has opened doors that I never thought possible. So someone wants to interview me for a job. They look me up, as one does. They see the podcast. And then I'm talking to them. I'm telling them about myself. I deliberately leave out the podcast. That way I don't come off across as, oh, I'm trying desperately. I'm trying too hard, like the kids say.
Yeah.
And then they were like, oh, we know about your podcast. And then I literally tear up. Like, this is so touching. There are people I've met at conferences who know the podcast.
Wow.
And then they're like, don't you do the podcast, the big picture? I'm like, oh, yeah. Like, yeah, the voice, I recall the voice. I'm like, so you can identify me based on my voice on a podcast.
Oh, that's cool. That's really cool.
So I use myself as an example all the time, saying you cannot know what you like to do if you don't keep trying so many different things. And nothing comes easy. There is no day I feel like recording an episode. But guess what? I do it anyway. And then
I think, Bidemi, that is a huge challenge for the younger generation. And I'm really trying to point out to them, you're being fed a diet of lies by social media and culture that tells you that if something hurts, you need to quit. And this is anathema to success. You will not move forward if you make this the narrative of how your life choices. Like you just said, like, it's hard and you keep doing it. Like, I can't tell you how many bad bosses I worked for in the CIA. I cannot tell you what a toxic environment I was working in. And I'm not talking about the terrorists that I worked with. That was actually in a delightful challenge. It was the internal stuff, but I didn't quit. Like I said, you might be the worst boss I've ever had. You might be a terrible human being, but I'm going to learn everything I can from you. I'm going to suck the life out of this, and I'm going to give everything that I have. And you might practically spit at me as we walk through the hallway. I'm going to smile at you and I'm going to say, good morning, sir. And I'm going to be the bigger person. And, at the end of that 10 years, it was a hard 10 years. I have a level of counterterrorism and counterintelligence expertise that you can't get working in the Paris and the Romes of the world, that you can only get working in the trenches, being in the war zones, having bad bosses, doing hard work. Like, don't give up. This has got to be our new message for the younger generation. Be willing to do hard things. Be willing to go where other people won't go. And then you're going to see this transformation of your life. Like you said, I love what you said. It was so good. The cumulative effect of those daily steps, like that's, again, where the magic happens. Like you never know when that's going to kick in, but it will kick in. It'll take longer than you think it should, but it will kick in.
So prior to this conversation, I think I emailed you in December, and then I sent another email earlier this morning. And then you were like, you felt overwhelmed with the level of preparation. And I had to pause and read that like 10 times, just conservative estimate, 10 times. And I'm thinking, and I'm saying to myself, me of 2 years ago wouldn't prepare this much for a podcast episode. And I'm like, at what point did I become this over preparer? Because to you, it gave you an impression of me. I wasn't doing it to impress you. I was just doing it to prepare for the conversation. And then it came across as, he does research.
Yeah.
He actually, and I'm just like, this comes to me naturally now. Like I said, I'm someone who has a podcast habit. Guess what? There's so many sub-habits that come with that, like preparation, the ability to speak before. If you listen to episode 1 of this podcast, when I go back and listen, I cringe. I physically cringe because I'm like, why am I saying So over the years, it has improved my presentation skills. It has improved my people skills. It has improved how I prepare for everything else. Like, I'm going to work. I have a presentation at work. Now I prepare way better because I took all the baby steps in this podcast, which is like a hobby at this point. Mm-hmm. So the little things I never thought I would have been able to benefit from. And if I had to pay money or go to Toastmasters to learn all these things, it would have cost significant resources, money, time, etc. But I just do this consistently every week, day in, day out. And all of these other benefits are accruing in a compounding way. It's just mind-blowing. I don't know.
It is mind-blowing, and it's very cool how that works. Yeah. And, I think actually you brought to life one of the concepts in the new book, which is a CIA secret, that I learned in my career, which is when you're preparing for an operation, you prepare the way that you prepared for this podcast, which was so diligent, which was so, so much effort that went into reviewing what we wanted to cover here. You think of all the things that could potentially go wrong in your operation. And you don't just like, oh gosh, I hope this goes straightforward. No, you assume it won't. And then you make preparations for if A happens, then I'll do B. If C happens, then I'll do D. And so you in your head, think up all the ways in which, things go sideways. Your source doesn't show up, or they're in the wrong place, or whatever. And so I get pulled over by host government services, the police, and that has happened to me. And what would I do if that happens? So what you're doing is you're preparing yourself to get off that X. Mm-hmm. You already told your brain, if this happens, here's what I'm going to do. You've even walked through, if I have to speak something out loud, how I'm going to say it. You've trained your brain so that when something does go south, you have the proper response, you get off the X. So I tell people, if you're trying to do something really important in your life, a new job, or you're pursuing a new skill set, or you're making a big decision, what you want to do is map out all the ways it could go wrong, try to account for that potential, and then move yourself forward. And then you can leave the stress behind because you've already thought about what could go wrong. You've kind of planned for that. I want to take a new job. It's going to pay less. Okay. So if the budget's going to be tight, here's where I can pull back on my budget. So there's ways you plan for that.
Right.
To get yourself through those hard times. And I think that's a really amazing skill set to take out of the CIA and apply to your career or your life.
Wow. So many nuggets. And again, I'm going to link to the new book and even the first book actually, in the episode show notes once this gets published. To be mindful of your time, I want to touch on some of the things you do now. So you mentioned how you basically provide consulting services. I read somewhere a little bird told me that you provide training to law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
Can you touch briefly on that and just say a few things about that?
Sure. So we have done this quite a bit recently where we have gained some insights. I'll give you an example. We live on the Space Coast of Florida, so there's a lot of technology and engineering firms, and we've got Space Force. We've got the Space Force base is literally across the river from me.
Nice.
We've got Blue Origins. We've got SpaceX. We have a launch almost every day. So we're a target-rich environment. And of great interest to primarily the Chinese government. And I kid you not when I say we have probably about 5 personal examples that we've either seen ourselves or someone we know well has brought to us of being targeted by the Chinese. And so once we were able to be like, wow, this is kind of a small town and yet it's happening right under our noses. And if you tell people in Brevard County, the Chinese intel services are here, they'll be like, come on. No, they're not. Yes, they are. And so we have done free training for local law enforcement that says, hey, guys, this is going on. This is what it looks like. Here's how you spot it. And here's what you can do about it as a law enforcement agency. So that's like one type of training that we've been giving.
Nice. And you mentioned the Chinese intelligence services are interested in American space operations and explorations. And I'm like, yep, I probably know a few things about that from when I worked at another company, a major telecommunications company here in Florida, actually. And I was an Intel analyst, just log in, do my work, go home. And there was this case where we kept seeing it was like a reconnaissance activity on one particular employee of this company. This employee worked on a special program where they basically worked on, let me just say,
okay.
And they were working on this special program, and coincidentally, another country's intelligence agency was interested in this individual. This person was a director because they wrote a term paper that was severely criticizing the spiritual leader of this country. This was 10 years ago when this person was a student at, interestingly, a university you're familiar with, Georgetown.
Okay. Yep.
So you're making connections I don't have to elaborate on. Anyway, 2 intelligence agencies targeted this person for 2 different reasons. We packaged everything we had, everything I saw into a file. We sent it over to the FBI. They wrote back to us, which is rare for the FBI to acknowledge something you sent to them.
Yeah.
They were like, thank you. We've seen other collection sources regarding this specific individual. And then they were like, really? HR had to freak out, basically saying, how is it a director at our company is getting all this attention? Do we need to talk to this person and maybe do something about their employment? Because this was an American. and it was for some reason getting all this attention. Why?
Yeah.
So so
Yeah.
that was back in 2018.
Yes.
So
And it's worse now.
yep. And I
Yeah.
think I published recently about something that happened at Vandenberg Space Force Base out in California. And then someone was actually caught. This is all public information. Someone was caught using a drone to take pictures during a Falcon 9 launch.
Yeah. See, we got that here. That's exactly the kind of thing. Yep.
Yep. So this is a Chinese national. This person flew
Yep.
in from Shanghai with their handler. And then I was telling my friends when I read the news, saying, I read the news and I read in between the lines.
Yeah.
Two people were caught flying a drone. One person was allowed to fly back to China. The other person was handed a 14-year sentence. How does that make sense to you? Because this other person probably has some diplomatic immunity. They had a non-official cover, which you're all too familiar with,
Yeah.
and they were allowed to return, never to come back to the US. But
Yep.
this other person basically owned a drone shop, and they're going to pay for the crime because they have a green card. If they didn't have a green card, they would have been deported.
Yep.
Guess what? They messed up by having a green card.
Right, right. And then, of course, what makes me feel really bad is the poor Chinese or Chinese Americans who are extorted by the Chinese government. You will provide this, or we're going to harm your family in China.
Right.
So, of course, we've got the Chinese who are just targeting us on a daily basis, which means we need people who understand the Chinese. Those are Chinese people, right? Chinese
Right.
Americans. So we have to find ways to hire those people and protect them from the Chinese government. So there's ways we can do that. There's ways we can insulate those people, but it has to be a very strategic effort on our part. Like, we need people who understand Chinese culture more than ever. Like, I don't know anything about Chinese culture. Like, I can't help you out there. We need those people. So how do we hire them, vet them, and then protect them so that they can't be blackmailed or extorted or, et cetera?
Wow. It's all, when people describe 4D chess, I'm like, what does that even mean? I find it difficult to understand regular chess. And now you're thinking 4D chess is just going all over my head. And this sounds like we basically need to be able to understand the level of strategic calculations, strategic maneuvers happening literally under our noses. So that way we can basically protect national
Yes.
assets and national security and so on, which is all the good work you and Mr. Assad has been doing so far. And thank you so much. Continue to do the great work you guys are doing. To wrap up, I want to touch on some of your personal reflections. What advice would you give to anyone who wants to work in intelligence, who wants to work with humans, to collect humans and process humans? What are those skill sets they need to have to be able to do this effectively?
So the first thing is to understand whether you fit the profile. You have those earlier values that we discussed, and be honest with yourself. Because if you don't even pursue it. But if you think you do, I get these questions actually a lot, Bidemi. People will say, well, what should I study that would make me competitive? Because when you think about, you can't just get an international relations degree. That's pretty meaningless. You have to do a deep dive into cyber, or be an expert in a part of the world that shows up in the headlines every day, like what we're talking about, China, Iran, Russia, the Arab world. Like, it's pretty obvious where we need that knowledge, or we need functional knowledge, like cyber, weapons of mass destruction. Even that's not a big, like drones, things like that.
Right.
And so you need to deep dive in your studies into those areas. I can only assume that the way I did it, with a lot of travel and overseas experience, is extremely helpful. If you're not already from another country, you definitely need that overseas time. So to the extent you can study abroad, that is extremely useful. And then to the extent you can learn a foreign language, that's also really important. I always tell people, if you think you're hiring for the US government, what are you going to look for? Somebody's got to stand out to you. Your resume has to have the keywords on it that the digital culling will, grab that resume, pull it out of the 10,000 other resumes the CIA gets. So whatever you can do to set yourself apart as a specialist in something the government, you're going to fill a need of the US government. So how can you best do that? That's what I would recommend. And also, don't get your sights just, oh, I have to work for the CIA. Like, there's multiple agencies you could probably work for and get that level of purpose and meaning out of it. So I'd say keep your field of vision as wide as possible while making yourself as interesting as possible.
Nice, nice. You couldn't have said it better. Keep your field of vision as wide as possible while making yourself as interesting as possible. And then so many books and podcasts would say you cannot come across as an interesting person if you're not yourself interested in other people.
Yes.
So it ties back to, you have to show interest in things, in people, in events, in other countries, other cultures. You have to be able to tell who is more senior when two people are entering a doorway. You have to be able to tell, do people in this country wear a particular color of ring? Why not? Etc. etc. Basically saying you have to leave your little bubble. You have to leave your little Instagram bubble, Twitter bubble, and just expose yourself more to the world so that you can absorb as much information as possible, which would make you interesting.
Yep. Amen.
So this has been a very, very, very insightful conversation. I'm so glad to have met you. I want to say after 4 years, but who's counting?
It's a delight. Thank you so much for having me on your amazing podcast.
Thank you so much. And like I said, I'm going to put links to everything, your websites, your books, your LinkedIn, and any other links you want me to include. Please send them my way. And yeah, hopefully keep the conversation going. And then I would, again, love to talk to you some other time permitting, because I know you're a very busy person. So.
Yeah, if your audience wants to know more, they should let you know what interests them, and then we can pursue those topics in the next conversation.
Sounds good. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Badami.